A very good morning to everyone. It's good evening here in Hyderabad. So I'm basically going to present the topic, which is very clear. Basically, it's about a sociolinguistic analysis of the names of three Indian Christian communities: Telugu Catholics, Kerala Syrian Christians, and Anglo-Indians of Hyderabad. So basically, the research objectives of my paper is on the similar. It basically looks at the similarities and differences between the proper names of three Indian Christian communities. The focus is similarities and differences. That is the Anglo-Indians, the Kerala Syrian Christians, and the Telugu Catholics. It also gives. I will also try to give a critical evaluation. Uh, um, uh, of the data elicitation techniques which were employed to collect names from the three Indian Christian communities. So I will first look at the similarities in naming styles between the two groups, that is the Kerala Syrian Christians and the Telugu Catholics. There were a couple of similarities if one looks at the adaptation strategies which were employed by the two groups. If one were to compare the form and derivation of the personal names, if one looks at the context, the background of Kerala Syrian Christians, it is in a recent claim by Ben-Hur, it has been well proven that the Kerala Syrian Christians have a Jewish ancestry. It was the Jewish Christians who were first baptized when St. Thomas first arrived in India, and that is how Christianity first was introduced to the Indians. And from the Jewish Christians, it was taken over by the natives, the natives of Kerala. So Aramaic was the language of the Jewish Christian, and Syriac, which is a derivative of Aramaic, was used in the church services initially. And therefore the names were Syriac in form, and these were the Syriac form of Christian names which were given to these Jewish Christians, and it was actually given to other natives later on. And the data of which was collected from the 20th century onwards in the churches of Kerala. So I basically looked at the data from 1938 to 37 to 38, sorry, and the baptismal names were clearly Syriac in nature. So one in course of time from the 20th century onwards to the 21st century, one can see that these Syriac names were combined with Dravidian nominals. So basically one can see the data here. So we have the first name, which is Syriac in nature, that is Abraham, and it is Abraham in Syriac, and then Shoshan, this is a female name, plus the Dravidian nominal Achan has been combined. So this is for males, and Amma among the females. So we can have names like Avrachan and among men, and you can see names like Shoshama among females. So this was a kind of a compound name which was found in the names of the data of Syrian Christians from the 1950s to the 80s. The second kind of an adaptation strategy which was found among the Syrian Christians of Kerala was the Syriac names were Malayalamized. So instead of Teresa, we could have names like Tresia, and instead of Thomas, one had the name Uman. So we had certain names like Kochu, which means small or young in Malayalam, which was combined with Tresia, the Malayalamized version of Teresa, and Amma. So these were the names which we saw among the Syrian Christians of Kerala. In the data, these were the names which were attested. A name like Kochu Tresiama, a name like Umachan, for instance. Similarly, one can see that from Malayalamized forms, there was an anglicization of Syriac names plus the Dravidian nominal. So we have names like Mary Kuti, which is a very common name during the 50s and the 80s, and James Kuti, which is a very common name among the Syrian Christians of Kerala. So these were the different adaptation strategies which were found in the data. Another kind of an adaptation strategy which were found among in the names of Kerala Syrian Christians was the trend of keeping family names, which was also an imitation of the upper caste Hindus, of the same, the Nambudris and the Nayars. So basically, I compared the names of the Nayars and Nambudris, and one saw that they too have surnames or family names appended to their personal names, which was also found among the Syrian Christians of Kerala. So a kind of such names one can see was the use of prepositional phrases or compounds. So a name like Tattan Parambil. So Tattan means a goldsmith, Parambu means land, and the locative marker il, which means in the land of goldsmith. Okay, so these were certain common patterns. Similarly, Puttan Veed. So Puttan means new, Veed is house, and new house. So these were the kind of names which were family surnames which were found among the Kerala Syrian Christians. And these were names similar to the upper caste Hindus of the same locality. So another kind of a thing, adaptation strategy, which was attested in the data was the use of repertoire, but the kind of repertoires, that one found in names. So for instance, traditionally the first son gets the name of the paternal grandfather and in the community, and the first daughter the name of the paternal grandmother. The second son gets the name of the maternal grandfather, and the second daughter the name of the maternal grandmother. The third son gets the name of his father, and the third daughter the name of her mother. The Nambudri naming tendency, which is the Nambudris are the Brahmins of Kerala, is also similar in nature. So basically, one could see a structure in naming like this. We have the personal name, the father's name, and the house name. So these were the patterns which were attested in the data. So, if one compares these with that of the Telugu Catholics, one can see that among the Telugu Catholics, casteism is very common. So, there was in the data they basically used pre-convert names, that is the names of their ancestors, and basically, if in here one as what we see as example over here is that these were the naming motivations which were given by the community members. And one of the community members said that they basically name for reservation benefits and also after grandfather, and because the name sounds good. So this was given by a parent for the name of their child, which was Jaswani Ratnakumar. So Ratnakumar was the name of his grandfather and Jaswani was the personal name. And so again, what basically was found among Telugu Catholics is that the Christians did not want to, they wanted to hide their Christian identities because they wanted to avail the reservations which are meant for the lower castes. In the public services. So one of the ways of hiding their Christian identity was through the use of pre-convert names, or through the use of Hindu names, actually. So this was another adaptation strategy used by the community members. Another kind of an adaptation strategy which was used by the community members was the use of dual names. One can see the use of dual names. So dual names, one can see over here that this is again one of the comments, one of the motivations listed by one of the community members. So one can read that I was christened on the day of the Three Kings festival, also known as the Three Wise Men's festival. When I was taken to church, the priest first wanted to name me Raja, which means King Day of the Three Kings festival, but he thought that Raja means only a king, and he christened me as Raja Rao, which means greater than a king. When I grew older, I asked my aunt why my name was not Christian but resembled a Hindu name. Then she discussed the above incident. So this is a kind of a dual name. So the name Raja is basically a Sanskrit name. It's Sanskrit derived, but it has a hidden Christian meaning among the community members. So another kind of a dual name was that people would have official names were different, which were the Hindu names or Sanskrit derived names, but they also had baptismal names which were used commonly among among the members of the church. And these were known only to the community members who were Christians. Then again, another kind of an adaptation strategy which was found among the Telugu Catholics was the use of caste titles. Caste system is, and this was again given by a community member. So caste system is very deeply rooted in the Catholics of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana states. And Telugu Catholics have typical names like Joseph Reddy, Sebastian Reddy, Mattia Reddy, which means Matthew Reddy, and Chinnapu basically means Paul. So Chinna means small, and Saint Paul was actually very tiny. So Chinnapu means small. Rayapu means Peter. So Raya means rock. So it can be translated as Peter. And similarly, Bala means infant Jesus. So in all these names, one can see that Reddy is a Hindu name and the personal name is basically a Christian name. So the above data very clearly shows that naming can also be a compromising strategy between the cultures where members maintain a Christian identity and also align with Hindu caste identities. So one can also now look at the differences between the two groups. Here I would like to bring in the differences between the Hyderabad Anglo-Indians and the Kerala Syrian Christians and Telugu Catholics. The Hyderabad Anglo-Indians, unlike the other two groups, clearly lacked any adaptation strategies and proper names. So as far as their form and derivation was concerned, they had European or English fashionable suffixes in names. So the Anglo-Indian names were based on modern European and English names. The beginning of the 20th century was marked by fashionable suffixes in European names, and these fashionable names mostly impacted female given names, where feminine suffixes were actually attached to the word basis of masculine names. A female name ending in ette, for instance, was very fashionable in France in the first half of the 20th century. And names with this suffix were also found in the Anglo-Indian names. So examples of these are Claudette. So you have Bernadette and Nicolette. So one can see that the basis, one has fashionable suffixes being appended to these names. And other examples of such suffixes where the Welsh feminine suffix is. So Anglo-Indian names with this suffix would be Glenys. So another kind of, if one compares this with the Kerala Syrian Christians and Telugu Catholic names, one can see that as I just discussed, that they were basically, the Kerala Syrian Christian names were basically Syriac with Dravidian nominals, and this was one of the adaptation strategy. Unlike the Anglo-Indian names, which basically used European suffixes, they followed the European styles in naming. And in among Telugu Catholics also, they are a recent group which has been converted. Their conversion is only 200 years old. Therefore, one can see that they used a lot of pre-convert names and dual names, trying to hide their identity. So this is a clear contrast with the Hyderabad Anglo-Indians. So as far as the surnames were concerned, here also we see that the Anglo-Indian surnames show a clear evidence of European lineage. So European surnames can be divided into the following categories. So we have the local surnames. These are the surnames which are based on a place name indicating the place where the man owned land or from where he came and lived. They can also be names based on topographical features and names based on estates. So the examples which I have mentioned over here are basically data taken from the Anglo-Indian surnames of the 50s, 80s and the 2000s. So we have names like Duckworth, which means from Duckworth, and we have names like Greenwood, which means dweller by the Greenwood. Then we also have the data also showed instances of surnames which were based on relationships, like patronymic relationships. So the examples again are taken from the Anglo-Indian data. So we have names like Dixon, that is Dick's son, and Davidson, son of David. Then surnames of occupation. So these surnames, which were the most varied due to work-based hierarchies during the medieval age. So examples of Anglo-Indian names which were occupational were footman, which is derived from the foot soldier, and similarly fisher, which means fisherman. Similarly, nicknames, which are also European, many modern surnames started out as nicknames, and they initially started out as derogatory labels among nobility, assigned by discontented peasants. So nicknames were based on the physical or behavioral peculiarities of an individual. They were also derived from the names of animals. So examples which were found in the Anglo-Indian data were May, so a young girl or a boy, also a pet form of Matthew; white, referring to fair complexion or hair. So basically what I inferred from this was that the Anglo-Indian surnames located individuals to a European ancestry. Whereas if one compares the Anglo-Indian surnames with that of Kerala Syrian Christians, which were an imitation of the upper castes of the region, it located individuals to a regional and social space in Kerala. So there was a clear contrast between the two groups. Now, let me also quickly discuss the methodology. Having discussed this, the methodology, I basically used four types of elicitation techniques in this particular study. One was the names register. So one of the ways by which I collected data was I went to the schools, took permission, and randomly every 10th name was collected from the data sets of Anglo-Indian Syrian Christians as well as Telugu Catholics. Another method was group survey. So this was the most productive one because at a short period of time, a lot of data could be elicited. So basically, what I did in this particular method was that I took permission of the parish priest, and after his permission was taken, I immediately after the mass service, after the church service, an announcement would be made, and in groups of 30s and 40s, the survey questionnaires would be distributed and data would be collected from people. So at a stretch one could get at least 30 samples of data. So this was the most productive kind of a method of collecting data. And then the third method was basically an online survey. So I basically used a Google form, and this was also very helpful. And people who were very comfortable, who were long distance, who were who lived in different parts of the world, found this method to be very productive, and especially during the pandemic. And then the fourth method was the face-to-face survey. So in the face-to-face surveys, there were people who wanted a lot of clarification, especially for the Telugu Catholics. I did some kind of a field work, and many of them were hesitant to participate in this survey because they actually saw me as an agent of the government. So they were very reluctant, and this was basically a drawback of this particular paper. I could only collect 62 interviews of Telugu Catholics in comparison to Syrian Christians and Anglo-Indians, who were in total 300 participants participated in this particular survey. But in comparison to that, the Telugu Catholics were very reluctant, and one of the reasons was that they found me to be, they suspected that I was an agent of the government, and I wanted, and they didn't want to get caught as far as their caste identity was concerned. So these were the conclusions of my paper. One of the conclusions was that proper names are basically, they can be used to convey distinct ethnic identities. So if one compares the proper names of Anglo-Indians and Kerala Syrian Christians, for instance, we can clearly see that then through naming styles or through naming tendencies, they show their ethnic ancestries. So for instance, their surnames locate them to two different groups. So for the Kerala Syrian Christians, they show ethnic identification with the upper caste Hindus of the region, whereas for the whereas for the Hyderabad Anglo-Indians, they basically show ethnic identification with the with European ancestry. So proper names can also be used for upward mobility. So for instance, among the Kerala Syrian Christians, they had Hindu naming styles, when they append the nominals amma, which actually means goddess, and which is actually used to show respect among the upper castes. The suffixation of kuti, which means child, and kochu to names is a clear imitation of the upper caste naming practices. So kuti means child, and kochu means child. So the meaning which is inferred by appending these nominals to first names is like as lovable as a child. So these naming styles very clearly indicate that by through the process of naming, they actually want to show that they are as elite and as through naming practices, and they basically want to show their upward mobility through naming practices. So one also sees in this data that naming practices can also be used to avail caste benefits in reservation policies. For instance, the Telugu Catholics through dual naming, as well as by through the usage of pre-convert names or ancestral names, they're clearly hiding their Christian identities, and so that they can avail the reservation policies in the government services, in the public services. So thank you very much. And I hope my presentation was clear, and now I'm ready to take questions. Thank you.
Maybe maybe I'll ask you something, because I was wondering when you gave us the examples from, well, the Kerala Syrian Christians community and the Telugu Catholics. You said that the data, the names were from the 1950s up to the 1980s, right? So I was just wondering if you have seen a sort of trend or an evolution or something in over the years, like names that were more popular in the 50s or in the 80s, this sort of trend.
As far as the Anglo-Indian names were concerned, there were no changes in patterns. There was a lot of consistency. It was very clear that their naming styles were oriented to European naming styles through the use of proper names and through the use of personal names as well as surnames. But as far as Kerala Syrian Christians, their names were concerned, there was a clear pattern, as you said. In the 50s, the use of compound names were very common. That is the appending of Amma and Achan. It was very common. But as in now, it was the 80s. Very clearly, there was a clear case, a shift to anglicized names and names, rhyming names, meaningless names. Names like Rimi, Rini, which so if one child in the family had Rimi, there was a tendency for parents to give Rini. So this was not just among the Kerala Syrian Christians, but this was also found among the other groups, the Muslims and the Hindus. So this was a transformation, in naming styles among the Keralites. So basically, what I understood from this is that very clearly parents didn't want to give names to their children which showed any kind of a religious association. So they basically, from the 80s onwards, parents gave names which were free from any religious identity, whether it was a Hindu, Christian, or a Muslim. So it was very common to have names like Biju Muhammad and Biju, or let's say Biju Jose, or let's say Biju Nair. So in all these cases, Biju is a meaningless name. It is just rhyming name, and you can have one can generate similar names like Biju, Siju, names. And this was a common trend, and there was a clear decline of Christian names, from the 80s onwards. And in the present age, that is from the 2000, the millennial children, as far as their naming styles is concerned, one can very clearly see that there is basically a tendency among parents to give names from the Old Testament, not the New Testament. So this is a general trend, which has been practiced, and it's not restricted to children who are settled in Kerala, but children who are also located overseas. This is a fashion which is actually spreading among the parents of Syrian Christians. So, but as far as Telugu Catholics are concerned, and I just mentioned in the presentation as well, there was not enough data. Only 62 people participated. So they were very scared, because they saw me as an outsider and they didn't want to participate. And the ones who participated on the condition that their identities would not be revealed. So there was a clear problem as far as data elicitation was concerned, as far as participation was concerned. So I could not see much of a pattern among Telugu Catholics
Mm.
as far as naming styles were concerned.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We
Yeah.
have 3 questions from the floor. I think the first one was Chris Devini. So, hi, Chris.
Thanks, Mirko. Thanks, Mirko. It's good to see you again. Smita, this is brief. I just wanted to thank you. This is fascinating ethnographic onomastic research, and to let people know that Brandon Simonson is preparing or will prepare a review of your new book. And so they can watch for that in an upcoming issue of Names. Thank you, Smita. Very, 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 very good.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Chris. Then I think that we have Laurel. Question from Laurel.
Yeah, so great research, really interesting. I'm curious whether it's common for people to change their names in these communities. It becomes more and more common here in the United States for people to voluntarily change their given names to something that they feel suits their identity more, whether that's their religious identity or their sexuality or some other thing. So do people ever change their first names?
Yeah, this is a very good one actually, and I saw in my sample, and this was common among. There were a couple instances among Malayali members, and I don't particularly remember that instance. I'll have to look up the data, but there was this particular case where a person changed his name to when he went to the north of India. So when he went to North India, he changed his name because his friends and his colleagues could not pronounce the Malayalam name. So he's working in news. He's a journalist. He's retired now, and very clearly there were very few cases where people changed their name to suit the northern pronunciation. So so in this particular case, I distinctly remember, his name was Malaikal. Malaikal, which is a Malayali surname, and he basically changed to Malayakan, so to make it sound more North Indian. So his friends, the reason given was his friends found Malayakal to be very difficult in pronunciation. Malayalam is very difficult for North Indians. So he changed it to Malayakan, which sounded more North Indian. So this was one of the few samples where people changed their name to, this was a case where somebody changed his name to to sound more North Indian, so that you could align with North Indian culture. This was a case, and this is one case that I very distinctly remember.
Yeah, great, thank you. That's so interesting.
Thank you. Then we have a question from Gerrit, but he also typed it here in the chat because his video is still now. And the question is, what is the freedom of parents? Is the surname hereditary? And you mentioned that a priest chose their name.
Yeah, this is again the transition that you were basically talking about. So in the 50s, the names were from a select repertoire. There was no freedom in naming, So as I just mentioned in the presentation, especially among the Kerala Syrian Christians, if the first child was born in the family, then parents had no choice but to give the name of the paternal grandfather if it was a male child. If it were a female child, the paternal grandmother. The first child had to be given that name. The parents didn't have any freedom. So, and if the second child was born, again, the parents didn't have any freedom. So one has to make a choice between the maternal grandmother or the maternal grandfather. The third child would get the name of the father or the mother. So there was no freedom in the 50s and the 60s. But in course of time, naming became very free. So for instance, there was, as I just mentioned, during the 80s, one saw the names of which were Sanskrit derived. So if supposing parents went to the North India, so in my own case, for instance, my mother very categorically told me that I was given a North Indian name and not the name of my maternal grandmother because I was born in North India. So they wanted to align with the North Indian culture. Similar cases emerged in the data where parents very clearly said that we wanted to give rhyming, fashionable names to our children. And not the traditional names to our children. So then parents had a volition, they actively, consciously wanted to align with North Indian culture and not the traditional naming styles. Or they wanted to not show their religious identity, and therefore they decided to give rhyming names to their children. And in the recent scenario, parents have consciously decided to either give anglicized names to their children so that they can easily relocate and align with the Western culture, or they basically, there is also a tendency to give names from the Old Testament. This is also an emerging trend among the community members. So as far as Kerala Syrian Christians are concerned, initially it was very traditional and rigid. Parents had no volition, but in course of time, one can see that one basically saw that there was a lot of volition and creativity as far as naming was concerned. So there were also instances where I saw in a particular case, parents gave a very creative name like Sin San, which I have not mentioned in the presentation because of the time constraint. So there were very peculiar names like Sin San. It was a created name, and the reason being given for such a name was that the parents said that Sin San means a child without sins. Sans is without, and sin means without sin. So these were creative names which parents, and in some cases parents openly said that we didn't want to give traditional hereditary names to our children the way we got them. So we have decided to give certain, some of them created, some of them chose names from the Old Testament, some of them decided to give North Indian names. So this also underwent a transition. The repertoire of names also underwent some kind of a transition. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. And we have another question from Cleve Evans.
Yes, I guess I was surprised in your talk, but there still would be a large community of Anglo-Indian people in Hyderabad. So I sort of have two questions about that. The first simple one is, do these people consider themselves citizens of India, or do they still have British citizenship? And
so as per the rule, yes, sir.
I guess the second part would be, do you know of any cases where people from that community have intermarried with people of Indian descent, and then how do they name their children if that happens?
So the first question is that as a rule, to be called an Anglo-Indian, the ancestry has to be from the male line. So the father has to be a European. The ancestry has to be European from the male line. So that's the Indian constitution. So that is a rule. So they follow the same thing. So if the mother is European and the father is not European, then the Constitution of India doesn't consider them to be Anglo-Indians. They don't even have Anglo-Indian membership. This is something which was very clearly mentioned to me. So yes, they consider themselves to be European, but I did not ask them explicitly whether you consider yourself European or not. But it is very evident through their naming that the patterns, whether it is the personal names or the surnames, whatever trends have been followed in the European nomenclature, they have followed the same trends, whether it is through the usage of suffixes or whether it is through the usage of surnames. So there is no change as far as, so basically what I'm trying to argue is that this is not the case as far as the Kerala Syrian Christians and the Telugu Catholics are concerned. They are clearly aligned with the Hindu naming styles. So this was one thing that I noticed. How they basically want to establish their ethnicity through names. So the Anglo-Indians were, I have not taken questions to prove whether they see themselves as Europeans or Indians, but through their naming styles, I'm basically trying to make this argument. And the other thing is that very clearly the mixed marriages cases, I didn't look at it. This is a very good question, and I would like to consider them for my future research. I only focused on instances where both parents were Anglo-Indians, and in such cases they also gave the same kind of names to their children, which were Anglo-Indian names, which were European in style actually.
Well, there is a comment here. It's Emilia Di Martino's comment, extremely interesting. Something similar used to happen in some areas of southern Italy in the early 60s. I was given my grandma's name, and some family strongly members really resented my dad not giving my sister his grandfather's name. This was because their families lived in a very small village, while city dwellers would be free in giving their kids the names they liked. So the names given depended where the name givers felt they belonged. So that's yeah, a comment. So with some similarities also in here in Italy.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
And also Luisa Cayazzo says that the same happened to her in Naples. So it's cross-cultural as well. Yeah,
that's right.
That's also fascinating, I think, to see patterns also somewhere else. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you again for this brilliant talk. It was very, very interesting.
Thank you.
And I think that also the questions were stimulating.